When I first moved to Salem, Massachusetts, I thought I was escaping my past. My divorce had been ugly, bitter words, broken promises, and a constant sense of emptiness that gnawed at me every night. So when I found the old house on Cedar Street, tucked away in a quiet corner of the town, it felt like a new beginning. The price was shockingly low, but I didn't ask questions. I just wanted to start over. First thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, like you'd expect in a small town. The heavy, oppressive quiet seemed to cling to everything. The houses around me looked as if they had seen better days. Peeling paint, overgrown lawns, windows that never opened. It was like the whole street was holding its breath, waiting for something. My new house was small and old, with creaky floors and a musty smell that no amount of air freshener could get rid of. Still, it had a certain charm, or at least that's what I told myself. The neighbors were distant. I'd see them occasionally, an old couple across the street, a young woman walking her dog, but they always seemed in a hurry to get away whenever I waved. The weirdest part was when I mentioned the house. Their expressions would tighten, eyes shifting away, as if they were afraid to look too long. On the second night, the noises started. At first, it was subtle. Faint scratching sound coming from the walls, like mice or maybe a tree branch brushing against the side of the house. But then the footsteps began. They were faint, almost imperceptible, unmistakable. Someone, or something, was walking around in the attic. My first thought was that I had a squatter. I grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat, heart pounding in my chest, and crept up the narrow stairs to the attic. It was empty. Dusty boxes and old furniture lay scattered around, untouched. But the air felt different. Colder, somehow. Thick, something I couldn't quite place. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. The footsteps had stopped. Maybe I was just imagining things, I thought, trying to convince myself as I went back downstairs. That night, barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, set my nerves on edge. I kept expecting to hear the footsteps again, but all I got was that oppressive silence, pressing in on me from all sides. The next day, I met the old man who lived a few houses down. He was tall and gaunt, with skin like parchment and eyes that seemed to see too much. He shuffled over as I was unloading groceries from my car and introduced himself as Mr. Thompson. There was something off about him, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "You're the new guy in the old Howard place, huh?" he asked, his voice raspy and low. When I nodded, he glanced around nervously, as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. "Listen, kid," he said, his tone deadly serious. "You need to stay inside after dark, and for God's sake, stay away from those woods." I laughed it off at first, thinking he was just some crazy old man with a wild imagination, but there was something in his eyes, a look of genuine fear that sent a chill down my spine. "Why?" I asked, half expecting some ridiculous ghost story. His answer was simple, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. "'Cause they never left." That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways, I couldn't shake his words from my mind. I locked every door, double-checked every window, but it did nothing to calm the growing sense of dread gnawing at me. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a soft, muffled cry like a child sobbing in the distance. It was coming from the woods behind my house. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to listen. The crying continued, growing louder, more desperate. I knew I should ignore it, stay inside like Mr. Thompson had warned. Something about that sound. Couldn't just leave it. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, my breath fogging up in the cold night air. The crying seemed to move as I did, leading me deeper into the woods. The trees closed in around me, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to grab me. The further I went, the more the crying seemed to echo, bouncing off the trees, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Finally, I reached a small clearing. Crying stopped. My breath caught in my throat as I swept the flashlight around. But there was nothing, just empty space, and the oppressive silence, thicker than ever. I stood there, heart pounding, the beam of light trembling in my hand. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I felt it. Cold breeze that seemed to come from nowhere, cutting through me like a knife. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew, without a doubt, that I was not alone. After that night in the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that empty clearing, heard that desperate crying. But what haunted me the most was the cold breeze that had cut through me. The touch of something not quite alive. I decided to take Mr. Thompson's warning more seriously. During the day, the neighborhood looked almost normal, but there was always a strange tension in the air, like the place was holding its breath. The old man himself seemed to watch me from a distance, his gaze heavy with something I couldn't quite understand. Was it pity? Fear? Maybe both. A few days later, I ran into the young woman with the dog again. Her name was Sarah, and she lived a few houses down. We exchanged polite small talk. Weather, work, the usual, until I mentioned the noises in my house. Her expression changed instantly, color draining from her face. She glanced around nervously, then leaned in close, lowering her voice. "You need to be careful," she said, barely above a whisper. "That house? It's not right. Everyone knows it, but no one talks about it. Not openly, at least." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart starting to race. I felt like I was on the edge of something, a truth that everyone else seemed to know, but was too afraid to share. She hesitated, looking over her shoulder as if she was being watched. "There's a history to that place. The family that lived there before you. They just disappeared one night. No one ever found out what happened to them. Some people say they moved away, but the truth is, they never left. Not really." Her words hung in the air, thick with implication. "You mean they're dead?" I asked, feeling a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. She nodded slowly. Something in that house, it drove them mad. First, it was just little things, noises, shadows, strange dreams, but it got worse. Much worse. I wanted to press her for more, but just then, Mr. Thompson appeared at the end of the street, glaring at us. Sarah quickly made an excuse and hurried away, her dog barking nervously as they disappeared around the corner. I was left standing there, more confused and frightened than ever. That night, the house felt different. Heavier, like the walls were closing in on me. The noises were back, louder and more insistent. Footsteps in the attic, whispering voices that seemed to come from the very walls. I tried to ignore them, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw faces. Pale, hollow-eyed faces watching me from the darkness. Around midnight, I heard a knock at the door. My heart nearly stopped. Who could be visiting at this hour? I crept to the door, peering through the peephole. It was Mr. Thompson, standing on my porch, his face half hidden in the shadows. I hesitated for a moment before opening the door. "You've seen them, haven't you?" he asked without preamble, his voice flat and emotionless. "Seen who?" I replied, though I knew exactly what he meant. Them, the ones who came before, the ones who never left. I felt a chill run down my spine. "I don't understand. What's happening to me? What's wrong with this house?" Mr. Thompson sighed, the sound weary and full of years of secrets. "The house, it's cursed, boy. There's something dark here, something evil. It feeds on people like you, those who are lost, broken. It draws you in, makes you see things, hear things, and once it has you, doesn't let go." I could feel my breath quickening, panic rising in my chest. But why? Why does it do this? He shook his head slowly. "No one knows for sure. Some say it's the land. There's been talk of old rituals, dark magic from back in the witch trials. Others think it's the house itself, that something terrible happened here. Something so awful it left a stain on this place that can't be washed away." I wanted to run, to get out of that house and never look back. But his next words stopped me cold. "It's too late for that," he said, as if reading my thoughts. "Once it's got its claws in you, there's no leaving. Not alive, anyway." Cold, suffocating fear settled over me, making it hard to breathe. "So what do I do? How do I stop it?" He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with a sadness that cut deeper than any blade. "You don't," he said finally. "You survive as long as you can. And when the time comes, pray for a quick end." He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in the doorway, paralyzed by fear. The wind howled through the trees, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, as if the night itself was closing in on me. I shut the door and locked it, feeling the weight of the house pressing down on me like never before. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I knew, whatever was in this house, it was hungry. And it wasn't going to stop until it had me. The nights that followed were a blur of terror and confusion. Whatever was in the house had become more aggressive, more determined to break me. Sleep was a distant memory. Every time I closed my eyes, the nightmares would drag me into their depths, showing me horrors that felt too real to be just dreams. It started with the whispers. At first they were soft, almost like a distant conversation I couldn't quite make out. But each night, they grew louder, closer, until they weren't whispers anymore. They were voices, clear and distinct, calling my name, begging for help, or sometimes just screaming. I tried to ignore them, but they followed me everywhere. In the shower, in the kitchen, even in the small dim light of my living room, the voices were there, growing more insistent with each passing hour. They came from the walls, the floor, the very air around me. No matter where I turned, there was no escape. The worst was the woman in black. At first, I thought she was just another figment of my imagination, another cruel trick this house was playing on me. But the more I saw her, the more I realized she was something else, something real, something evil. She appeared in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. I'd catch a glimpse of her in the mirror as I washed my face, her hollow eyes staring back at me, her lips twisted into a cruel smile. Sometimes she'd be waiting at the end of the hallway, her dark dress flowing around her like smoke, her presence suffocating, oppressive. I could feel her watching me, her gaze burning into my skin, but when I turned to face her, she would vanish, leaving nothing but the cold, empty air. One night, I woke to find her standing at the foot of my bed. Pale, gaunt face was inches from mine, her breath cold against my cheek. I froze, unable to move, unable to scream. All I could do was stare into those empty eyes, feeling my sanity slip away with every passing second. "Join us," she whispered, her voice like nails on a chalkboard, scraping at the inside of my skull. "Join us in the dark." I snapped. I leaped out of bed, grabbing the lamp from my nightstand and hurling it at her. The lamp shattered against the wall. The room plunged into darkness. When I turned on the lights, she was gone. But the damage was done. I could still feel her presence, lingering in the shadows, waiting for the moment when my guard was down. The days were no better. House was alive, twisting and warping around me. I'd leave a room only to return and find it different. Furniture moved, windows open that I knew I had shut. The air itself seemed to thrum with a low, pulsing energy that made my skin crawl. Couldn't tell what was real anymore. Everything felt wrong, like the world had shifted slightly off its axis, leaving me trapped in some nightmarish version of my life. I tried to reach out for help, but no one would listen. I called Sarah, desperate for someone to talk to, but she didn't pick up. When I went to her house, I found it abandoned, windows boarded up, doors locked tight, as if she had fled in the middle of the night. I was alone, completely and utterly alone, except for the whispers, and the woman in black, and the footsteps that followed me, no matter where I went. I found myself talking to the house, begging it to leave me alone, promising that I'd do anything if it would just let me go. But the more I pleaded, the more it seemed to tighten its grip on me. It was as if the house was feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every scream, every tear. One evening, I tried to leave. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and made a run for the door. But as soon as I stepped outside, the air grew thick, heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. The trees seemed to bend toward me, their branches reaching out like claws. The street, once familiar, now twisted and stretched into an endless, shadowy maze. No matter how far I ran, I always ended up back at the house, staring at the front door, my own panicked reflection in the windows. I was trapped. The house wouldn't let me go, and deep down, I knew it never would. Final straw came one night when I found myself in the attic, place where all this madness had begun. I didn't remember going up there, but somehow I was standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by old, dusty boxes and broken furniture. Air was freezing, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and refused to let go. I felt a presence behind me, and I knew who it was. I didn't need to turn around to see her. The woman in black was there, closer than she had ever been. Her breath was cold against my neck, her whispers like poison in my ear. "Join us," she said again, and this time, it wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Something inside me snapped. I spun around, ready to fight, ready to do anything to make her stop. There was nothing there. Just empty space and the overwhelming, suffocating darkness. And then the attic door slammed shut, trapping me inside. I screamed, pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to close in around me, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. The air thickened and I could barely breathe. I was drowning in the darkness, lost in the madness that had taken over my life. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The door creaked open, the whispers fell silent, and the cold presence vanished. But the damage was done. I staggered out of the attic, shaking, my mind shattered, my sanity hanging by a thread. I knew then that there was no escape. The house had claimed me, just as it had claimed those before me. I was lost, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever find my way back. The days blurred together after that night in the attic. I was a shell of myself, barely functioning, haunted by shadows and whispers that never let up. I stopped eating, barely slept, and when I did, it was only to fall into the same hellish nightmares, where the woman in black waited for me with those hollow eyes, icy breath always just a whisper away. I knew I was running out of time. The house was wearing me down, breaking me apart piece by piece. I could feel it tightening its grip on my mind, and I knew that if I didn't do something soon, I'd end up like the others, just another lost soul trapped within these walls. I needed answers. Real answers. Not the cryptic warnings and half-truths I'd been getting from the neighbors. If I was going to survive, I had to understand what was haunting this place and why it had chosen me. So I did the only thing I could think of. I went back to the library. The librarian, a frail woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, eyed me with a mix of curiosity and pity as I walked in. I must have looked like a wreck. Disheveled, unshaven, dark circles under my eyes. But I didn't care. I went straight to the archives, determined to dig deeper into the history of my house, find anything that could help me make sense of the nightmare I was living. After hours of searching, I found it. An old, yellowed newspaper article from the 1970s. It was buried in the back pages. A small, easily overlooked piece about a family that had once lived in my house. The Howard family. The article was brief, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. The family had been found dead in the house, under mysterious circumstances. The parents, Robert and Mary Howard, and their 2 young children. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of foul play. They had simply died. The coroner's report listed the cause as natural causes, but the tone of the article suggested something much darker. The neighbors reported hearing screams in the middle of the night, strange lights flickering in the windows, and the smell of burning candles. But the most chilling part was a single sentence near the end of the article. Local folklore suggests the Howard house was built on cursed land, a site of dark rituals dating back to the Salem witch trial. I sat there, staring at the words, feeling the weight of them settle over me like a shroud. Cursed land, dark rituals, the witch trials. It all made a sick kind of sense. The house wasn't just haunted. It was a focal point for something much older, much more powerful. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I found a reference to a woman named Abigail Blackwood, one of the last women accused of witchcraft during the Salem witch trial. She had lived on the very land where my house now stood. According to the records, Abigail had been a healer, an herbalist, but the townspeople had accused her of consorting with dark forces. She was tried, found guilty, and executed. But before she died, Abigail had cursed the land, vowing that those who lived there would never know peace, that they would be haunted by the darkness she had been accused of embracing. And it seemed that her curse had taken root, poisoning the ground, seeping into the walls of the house, feeding on the souls of anyone unlucky enough to call it home. The woman in black, the one who haunted my dreams, my waking hours, she wasn't just a ghost. She was Abigail, or what was left of her. Twisted by centuries of rage, pain, and dark magic, she had become something more than human, a malevolent force that was determined to drag me down into the darkness with her. I knew then that there was no reasoning with her, no way to appease her. The house, she wanted me broken, wanted me dead. And if I didn't find a way to break the curse, I would be. I returned to the house, armed with what little knowledge I had gained, but also with a growing sense of dread. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the house knew I was close to uncovering its secret. The shadows seemed to move on their own, stretching out toward me as I made my way to the living room. I had no plan, no idea of what to do next. But I knew I couldn't just sit and wait to be consumed by the darkness. I needed to confront her, to face whatever evil had taken hold of this place and find a way to end it. I found myself in the basement, one place I had avoided since moving in. The air was damp, cold, the smell of mold and decay thickened my nostrils. The walls were lined with old brick, and the floor was dirt, packed hard by decades of neglect. In the center of the room, a circle had been drawn into the dirt, faint, almost erased by time. Still there, the symbols carved into the earth, dark and menacing. I recognized them from the books I had seen at the library, witchcraft symbols, used in rituals to summon or bind spirits. This was it, the source of the curse. Place where Abigail had bound herself to the land, to the house, the epicenter of all the evil that had consumed the Howard family, and now, me. I didn't know what I was doing, but something inside me, some primal instinct, told me what needed to be done. I took out a piece of chalk I had grabbed from the kitchen and traced over the symbols, completing the circle. As I did, the temperature in the room dropped, and I could feel her presence growing stronger, angrier. "Abigail," I whispered, voice trembling. "I know what happened to you. I know the pain you went through, the injustice you suffered. But this isn't the way." The air around me began to swirl, cold wind whipping through the basement, stirring up dust and debris. I could hear her voice in the wind, angry, defiant, and full of hatred. "You think you can free yourself?" Voice hissed, echoing in my mind. "You think you can escape the fate that I have planned for you?" I pressed on, my heart pounding in my chest. "This curse, your curse, has done nothing but bring more pain, more suffering. It's time to end it. It's time to let go." The wind howled, and I felt a force pushing against me, trying to knock me down, trying to stop me. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I began to speak words I didn't fully understand, words I had read in the old books, words meant to break the hold of dark magic. As I spoke, the symbols in the circle began to glow. Faint, eerie light that pulsed with power. The ground shook, the walls trembled, and the air grew thick with the scent of burning candles, same scent the neighbors had reported all those years ago. And then she appeared. Abigail. Her form was twisted, barely recognizable as human, her face a mask of rage and sorrow, her eyes burning with an unnatural fire. "You cannot stop this," she screamed, her voice reverberating through the walls. "You will join them. You will all join them." But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I kept chanting, the words pouring out of me in a desperate rush, my voice rising above the chaos. For a moment, I thought it wouldn't work, that the curse was too strong, that I was too late. But then, the glow of the symbols flared brighter, and Abigail let out a piercing scream, a sound that shook the very foundations of the house. The light grew brighter, blinding, and I had to shield my eyes. I could feel the pressure building, the house itself groaning as if it were being torn apart from the inside. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Light faded, the wind died down, and the basement was plunged into silence. I opened my eyes and found myself alone. The circle was still there, the symbols now dull and lifeless, but the oppressive presence that had filled the house was gone. Abigail was gone. Curse, broken. I don't know how long I stood there, trembling, half expecting her to reappear, to drag me down into the darkness with her. But she never did. The house was silent, still, almost peaceful. I made my way back upstairs, my legs shaking, my heart still pounding in my chest. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from its walls. But the damage had been done. Couldn't stay here, not after everything that had happened. I packed a bag, not caring what I took, and left without looking back. As I drove away, the house faded into the distance. Just another old, empty building in a quiet neighborhood. But I knew better. I knew what had happened there, and I knew that I would never be the same. Abigail Blackwood had been laid to rest. The scars she left on that house and on me would never fully heal. I've always heard that small towns have their secrets, but I never thought I'd stumble into one myself. Millfield, Ohio, was supposed to be my fresh start, a place to leave behind the noise of the city, the failed relationships, the nightmares that kept me awake at night. When I first drove into the neighborhood, I was struck by how perfect everything seemed. Tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns, kids playing outside like something out of an old TV show. It was almost too perfect. The house I bought was a fixer-upper, but it had charm, or at least that's what I told myself. The paint was peeling, the floorboards creaked with every step, and the attic, well, the less said about the attic, the better. Felt like a place with history, and maybe that's what drew me in. I should have known better. I'd barely unpacked my boxes when I met him. My neighbor, Mr. Whitaker. He was an older guy, maybe in his late 60s, with this gaunt look that made him seem like he'd crawled out of the pages of a Gothic novel. His house was right next door, a looming, decrepit place that made my fixer-upper look like a brand new build. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, welcome to the neighborhood and all that. There was something off about the way he looked at me. His eyes were too intense, too knowing. You'll want to stay inside after dark. Dead, most casually, like he was giving me a tip about the weather. I laughed it off, thinking it was some old man's superstition, but he didn't laugh with me. Instead, he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This place isn't like other towns. You'll see." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and mumbled something about needing to finish unpacking. As I walked away, I could feel his eyes on my back like a prickling heat on my skin. I shut the door behind me, but it didn't make me feel any safer. In fact, it made the house seem quieter, the air heavier. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that I was just tired, that I was letting the creepiness of the old place get to me. But deep down, I felt it, the unease, the sense that I just stepped into something I wasn't ready for. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring, makes your heart race for no reason. I kept thinking about Mr. Whitaker, about the way he'd looked at me like he knew something I didn't. My thoughts were interrupted by a sound, faint creak coming from somewhere above me. The attic. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling. The sound came again. This time it was louder, more deliberate. Footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest as I forced myself to listen, straining to hear anything, over the rush of blood in my ears. Another creak, then another, each one closer than the last. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Footsteps stopped directly above my bed. Then, the house fell silent again. I waited for what felt like hours, every muscle in my body tense, ready to bolt at the slightest noise. But nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, the events of the night before felt distant, like a bad dream. But as I stepped outside to grab the newspaper, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The streetlight in front of my house was shattered, shards of glass scattered across the pavement. I looked up and down the street, but everything else was intact. Just mine, as if something, or someone, had targeted it specifically. As I stood there, I caught sight of Mr. Whitaker watching me from his front porch. He didn't say anything, just nodded once, slowly, before turning and disappearing into his house. I felt a cold dread settle in my gut. This wasn't just a bad dream. This was real, and whatever was happening, it had only just begun. The next few days were a blur of unpacking and trying to settle in. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel eyes on me. Neighbors watching from behind curtains, their gazes hidden but unmistakable. It wasn't just Mr. Whitaker. It was everyone. The friendly smiles I'd expected from a small town felt hollow, like everyone knew something I didn't, something they weren't going to tell me. It wasn't long before the strange occurrences at night became a regular thing. Every night at exactly 3:15 a.m., I'd hear it. The streetlight in front of my house would flicker, then go out completely. At first I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just faulty wiring. But then the sounds in the attic started up again, louder and more insistent. It was like someone, or something, was pacing back and forth, right above my bed. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I decided to talk to the only person who seemed willing to give me any sort of clue, Mr. Whitaker. I walked over to his house, half expecting him to slam the door in my face. Instead, he opened it before I could even knock, as if he'd been expecting me. "I see you've been hearing them too," he said, his voice low and grave. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, hoping he'd keep talking. You're not the first one they've tried to scare off, but you might be the first who's curious enough to stay. Who? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mr. Whitaker glanced around, his eyes darting nervously to the dark corners of his porch. This neighborhood, he said slowly, isn't just a place. It's a sanctuary, sorts. A sanctuary for things that should have died a long time ago. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. What do you mean? They're trapped here, he continued, his voice growing more intense. The spirits, the restless dead. This place keeps them bound, but they're not happy about it, and they sure as hell don't like newcomers. I wanted to laugh, to tell him he was crazy, but the words died in my throat. Deep down, I knew there was something to what he was saying. I'd felt it ever since I arrived, that sense of being watched, being unwelcome. Why don't people leave? I asked. Some have, he said, but most don't get the chance. The ones who try, well, they either disappear or they end up like me. Too scared to run, too scared to stay. I left Mr. Whitaker's house with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. I needed to find out what had happened in this neighborhood, what had trapped these spirits here. And more importantly, I needed to figure out how to survive it. That night, as I sat in my living room with every light in the house on, I started digging. Old newspaper archives, forums about haunted places, anything I could find about Millfield and its history. It didn't take long to discover that this place had a dark past. Back in the late 1800s, there'd been a string of disappearances, mostly travelers passing through, but a few locals too. They were never found, and eventually, people stopped looking. But the rumors persisted. Whispers of a cult, of rituals that required human sacrifices, of souls being bound to the very earth beneath the town. And then I found something that made my blood run cold. A grainy old photograph from a newspaper, dated 1895, showed a group of men and women standing in front of a large house. The same house I was living in now. But what caught my attention wasn't just the house. It was the man standing at the center of the group, his face stern, eyes filled with something dark and unreadable. It was Mr. Whitaker. The moment I saw that photograph, everything changed. My hands shook as I stared at the image, the grainy black and white lines blurring as my mind tried to make sense of it. There was no mistaking it. Mr. Whitaker looked exactly the same as he did today, as if the last 130 years hadn't touched him at all. I slammed my laptop shut, my heart racing, my mind whirled with possibilities, none of them good. Who the hell was Mr. Whitaker? How was he connected to whatever dark forces had been at work in Millfield for over a century? And most terrifying of all, what did he want from me? That night, sleep was out of the question. I paced the creaky floors of my house, every shadow twisting into something sinister, every noise a potential threat. The old house groaned and sighed like it was alive, like it was trying to tell me something. If only I could understand. As the hours ticked by, I felt the walls closing in on me. The air grew thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on my chest. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I needed to get out of the house, to clear my head, but the thought of stepping outside into the pitch-black night, of being watched by unseen eyes, paralyzed me with fear. At some point, the exhaustion caught up with me, and I collapsed into a restless sleep on the couch. My dreams were a jumbled mess of memories and nightmares. Faceless figures standing over me, whispers that I couldn't quite hear, and Mr. Whitaker's piercing gaze, always watching, always knowing. When I woke up, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows through the windows. For a moment I felt a brief sense of relief. Daylight had always made everything seem less terrifying. But as I sat up, groggy and disoriented, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. Scrawled across the wall opposite me in what looked like charcoal were 3 words, "You are next." I scrambled off the couch, my heart pounding in my ears. The words were smeared and uneven, as if written in a hurry. Who had done this? And how had they gotten into my house? I backed away, nearly tripping over a stack of unpacked boxes, my mind spinning. Was this a threat? A warning? Or worse, a promise? I needed answers, but more than that, I needed to get out of here. But as I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, a sudden realization stopped me cold. Couldn't leave. Not yet. If I ran, I'd be just another name in Millfield's long history of disappearances. Another soul claimed by whatever darkness was festering. No, I needed to know what was going on. I needed to fight back. With that thought stealing my resolve, I made my way back to Mr. Whitaker's house. This time I wasn't going to take any cryptic warnings or half-answers. I wanted the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. He opened the door before I could knock, just like last time. But this time, there was no hint of a welcome in his eyes. They were cold, almost resigned. "You found the photograph," he said. Not a question, but a statement. I nodded, my throat dry. "What are you?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. Mr. Whitaker sighed, a sound filled with centuries of weariness. "Not what you think," he replied, "but I've been around long enough to know how this ends." I didn't understand what he meant. Before I could ask, he stepped aside, motioning for me to enter. The interior of his house was dark, lit only by the weak light filtering through heavy curtains. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, and something else, something that made my skin crawl. He led me to a small sitting room, where the walls were lined with bookshelves filled with ancient, dusty volumes. In the center of the room was a table, and on it, a large, leather-bound book lay open, its pages filled with symbols and writing that looked like no language I'd ever seen. "This is the history of Millfield," Mr. Whitaker said, his voice low and somber, "and your place in it." He pointed to a page near the middle of the book, where a rough sketch of a man was drawn. The resemblance was unmistakable. It was me. Beneath the sketch, in dark, bold letters, was a single word: sacrifice. My blood ran cold as I stared at the page, the implications sinking in like a lead weight in my stomach. "What the hell is this?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's your fate," Mr. Whitaker replied, his tone matter-of-fact as if we were discussing the weather. "This town, this place, it needs souls to survive, new blood to feed the old. It's been that way for generations, and now it's your turn." I backed away from the table, shaking my head in disbelief. "No," I said, my voice rising with panic. "I'm not going to be your sacrifice. I'm getting out of here." But as I turned to leave, Mr. Whitaker's voice stopped me in my tracks. "You can try to run," he said softly, "but Millfield doesn't let go that easily. The cult, the spirits, they're bound to this place, and so are you now. There's no escaping it. You're already part of the ritual." His words echoed in my mind as I stumbled out of the house and into the harsh daylight. The whole town seemed to close in around me. Quaint houses and manicured lawns now twisted into something sinister, something inescapable. I knew then that there was no running from this. Whatever Millfield had planned for me, it wasn't over. It was just beginning. I stumbled back to my house, my mind racing, heart pounding. The word sacrifice echoed in my head like a death knell. I couldn't stay, but I couldn't leave either. At least, not the way I'd planned. Mr. Whitaker's words kept playing over and over in my mind. Millfield doesn't let go that easily. But I wasn't going down without a fight. I grabbed a duffel bag and began stuffing it with essentials. Cash, a flashlight, my grandfather's old hunting knife. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I needed to be prepared for anything. As I packed, the house seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing tighter, the shadows growing darker. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the house itself was alive and watching me. Then, I heard it, the familiar creak of footsteps overhead. Only this time, it wasn't just a single set of footsteps. It was many, all moving in unison, a slow, deliberate march across the ceiling. They were above me, behind me, surrounding me. I knew it was only a matter of time before they came for me. I needed to get out of there, now. I bolted for the door, but as I reached for the handle, the entire house seemed to shudder. The walls trembled, the floor beneath my feet groaned, and suddenly, front door slammed shut, the lock clicking into place on its own. Panic surged through me as I yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The windows, too, were sealed tight, as if the house had become a prison, trapping me inside. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were directly behind me. I spun around, knife in hand, ready to face whatever was coming. But there was nothing there, just the empty, darkened hallway. My breath came in ragged gasps, my pulse thundering in my ears. The house was playing with me, tormenting me, and I was losing my grip on reality. Then, the whispering started. It was soft at first, just a low murmur like the rustling of leaves. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the entire house, echoing off the walls, seeping into my mind. The voices overlapped, a chorus of the damned, all chanting the same word over and over. Sacrifice. 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 I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The voices were inside me now, gnawing at my sanity, driving me to the edge. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face, begging for it to stop. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering ceased. The silence was deafening. But it was a relief, however brief. I slowly got to my feet, my whole body trembling. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I had to keep moving. I had to get out of this house, out of this town, before it consumed me completely. I headed for the back door, but as I reached it, the room grew cold. So cold that my breath came out in visible puffs of air. Temperature dropped rapidly, frost creeping up the windows, turning the walls to ice. And then, in the center of the room, a dark figure began to materialize. It was tall and shadowy, its features indistinct, undeniably menacing. It felt ancient, malevolent, its presence radiating pure evil. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. But as I did, the figure spoke. Its voice low, gravelly, and filled with malice. "You are not the first," it said, voice echoing through the frozen room. "And you will not be the last." I tried to speak, to ask who or what it was, but the words caught in my throat. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or think. The figure began to advance on me, its form growing more defined with each step. It had no face, no eyes, but I could feel it staring into my soul, stripping away every defense I had left. Then, the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I was never meant to escape. From the moment I set foot in Millfield, I had been marked, chosen. This wasn't just a haunting. This was a ritual, an ancient, dark tradition that had been going on for centuries. And I was its latest victim. The town needed me, needed my soul to sustain its cursed existence. Each new resident, each unwitting newcomer, was lured here, drawn into the trap like a moth to a flame. Mr. Whitaker, the spirits, the cult, they were all part of it, all bound by the same ancient pact. And now, I was too. The dark figure loomed over me, its presence suffocating, the air around me freezing solid. My breath caught in my throat, my body frozen in place as its shadowy hand reached out, inches from my face. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. But instead of cold, I felt warmth, soft, almost gentle touch on my forehead. The whispers returned, but this time they were soothing, like a lullaby. The darkness around me faded, replaced by a blinding white light, warm and comforting. It was as if I was being pulled into something greater, something beyond the horrors of Millfield. As my consciousness began to slip away, a final thought crossed my mind, a realization that brought a twisted sense of peace. I wasn't just the next sacrifice, I was the final sacrifice. Millfield's curse was nearing its end. The ritual would be complete, and the town would finally be free, released from the darkness that had bound it for so long. And in doing so, I would be too. The light consumed me, and everything went silent. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed these chilling stories as much as I enjoyed sharing them with you. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up to keep the terror coming. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring even more spine-tingling content your way. Before you go, don't forget to check out the video playing on the screen. It's packed with more unsettling tales and eerie experiences that you won't want to miss. If you have any frightening stories of your own or suggestions for future content, drop them in the comments below. Stay tuned for more haunting adventures. Until next time, sleep tight, decant.